Most people, when they hear Sleepy Hollow, they think of Washington Irving. They think of a clumsy schoolteacher and a pumpkin-headed ghost on a thundering steed. It's a great story, a classic piece of American folklore. But I lived there for 3 years, and I can tell you, the horseman isn't the only ghost that calls that valley home. And he's certainly not the one you should be most afraid of. I moved there in the autumn of 2008. I just finished my graduate degree in historical preservation and landed a dream job. For a nerd like me anyway. I was hired by a private trust to help archive and restore a collection of documents from some of the old Dutch families, the original settlers of the area. The pay wasn't fantastic, but it came with housing a small, 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve. It was old, built in the late 1800s, but it was charming, and the rent was practically nothing. It felt like I'd won the lottery. The first few weeks were idyllic. The work was fascinating, digging through brittle, leather-bound ledgers and letters written in elegant, spidery script. I spent my days breathing in the scent of old paper, and my evenings walking the trails that snaked through the preserve. The woods there are different. They're ancient. The trees are tall and gnarled, and they grow so close together that even on the brightest day, the forest floor is dappled in a perpetual twilight. There's a quiet there that feels heavy-weighted. It wasn't menacing, not at first. It just felt watchful. My cottage was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by a ring of towering white pines. At night, when the wind blew down from the hills, it would move through those pines and create a sound I'd never heard before. It wasn't a rustle. It was a soft, sibilant whisper. It sounded almost like voices, thousands of them, all murmuring at once, just on the edge of intelligibility. I told myself it was just the wind, the unique acoustics of the clearing. I'd sit on my porch with a cup of tea and listen to it, finding it soothing. That was my first mistake. The real trouble started about a month in. I was working on a set of journals from a man named Henrik Van Tassel, a distant cousin of the famous Katrina from Irving's story. His entries, dating back to the 1780s, were mostly mundane: crop yields, land disputes, town gossip. But then I found a series of entries that were different. The handwriting became frantic, jagged. He wrote about a sickness that had swept through the small settlement just outside the main village. It wasn't a physical illness. He called it the whisper sickness. He described people, his neighbors, becoming distant and secretive. They would spend hours standing at the edge of the woods, just staring into the trees. They'd neglect their farms, their families. When spoken to, they'd seem confused, their eyes unfocused, and they would murmur to themselves constantly. Henrik wrote that if you listened closely, it sounded like they were trying to mimic the sound of the wind in the pines. Then, they started disappearing. One by one, they would walk into the woods and never come back. The last entry was chilling. "Ulsbeth is gone now. I heard her talking to them last night, through the walls. She called them the Kinderen van de Pigeonboom, the Pine Children. They promised her she wouldn't be lonely anymore. The wind is calling for me too. I don't know how much longer I can ignore it." After that, the journal was blank. I closed the book, my heart pounding. It was just a story, a piece of local folklore born from the hardships of colonial life. That's what I told myself. But that night, the whispering of the pines outside my cottage didn't sound soothing anymore. It sounded persuasive. I started keeping the windows closed, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. Things escalated. I'd come home from work to find things moved. A book pulled from the shelf and left open on the floor. A chair dragged into the center of the room, facing the woods. I tried to rationalize it, a draft. The old house settling. But I knew better. One evening, I was washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window at the dense wall of trees. For just a second, I saw something. A face. It was pale and gaunt, with large, dark eyes, peeking from between two thick trunks. I dropped the plate, and it shattered in the sink. When I looked back up, it was gone. I installed a security camera, one of those motion-activated ones, pointed at the edge of the clearing. The first few nights, nothing. Just raccoons and the occasional deer. I started to think I was losing my mind, that the isolation and the old stories were getting to me. Then, on the fourth night, I got a notification on my phone at 3:17 a.m. My hands were shaking as I opened the app. The video was grainy, shot in black and white infrared. The clearing was empty. Then, from the right side of the frame, something walked into view. It was a child. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing what looked like a simple, old-fashioned dress. Her hair was long and unkempt. She walked slowly, deliberately, to the center of my yard and stopped. She just stood there, perfectly still, staring directly at my cottage. At my window. The timestamp showed she stood there for 45 minutes without moving a muscle. A cold dread, so pure and so absolute, washed over me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a lost kid. Then, just before the clip ended, she did something that made me want to vomit. She lifted her head, opened her mouth wider than seemed humanly possible, and a sound came out. It wasn't a scream. It was a perfect imitation of the whispering pines. That same sibilant, murmuring chorus, but from a single, human throat. The next day, I didn't go to work. I drove into Dudleytown and went to the local historical society, a place I usually avoided because the curator, a cranky old man named Alistair, disliked my employer. I found him hunched over a map. I didn't even say hello. I just asked him, "Who are the Pine children?" Alistair went pale. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a deep sigh rattling his chest. He led me to a back room, a dusty archive that smelled of decay. He pulled out a heavy, unmarked box. Inside were dozens of old photographs, tintypes and daguerreotypes of children, and case files, missing person reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, all from Sleepy Hollow and the surrounding hamlets. Dozens of them, all children, all of whom were last seen walking toward the woods. Alistair told me the story the official histories leave out, that the woods, particularly the ancient pine groves, were considered sacred, dangerous ground by the native tribes who lived there long before the Dutch arrived. They believed a spirit, an entity, lived in those woods. It was a hungry, lonely thing, and it mimicked the voices of lost loved ones, whispering on the wind to lure people, especially children, into its embrace. Once they were taken, they became part of it. Their own voices added to the chorus, their forms used as lures for the next victim. The Kinderen van de Peachboom. The Pine children. They weren't ghosts of the dead. They were the bait. "You live in the old groundskeeper's cottage, don't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak. "That clearing," he said, "who's to be the heart of one of the largest groves. They cut most of it down in the 1880s to build those houses. But the entity, it never left. It just got quieter, more patient. It remembers where its heart was." I drove back to the cottage in a daze. It was late afternoon, and the light was already fading. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw her, the little girl from the video. She was standing at the edge of the woods, in the exact spot I'd seen the face. She wasn't looking at the house anymore. She was looking right at me in my car. She smiled, a slow, unnatural stretching of her lips, and then she raised one hand and beckoned, and the whispering started. Not just from the pines, but from everywhere. It was inside my car, inside my head. A symphony of soft, pleading voices. My mother, who passed away a decade ago. My childhood friend, who I hadn't spoken to in years. Voices I knew and loved, all woven into that awful, sibilant rush. They were telling me to get out of the car, to come join them, to not be lonely anymore. It was the most tempting, beautiful, and horrifying sound I had ever heard. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screaming on the gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even go inside. I drove until the sun came up, and I didn't stop until I'd crossed the Pennsylvania state line. I called my employer from a gas station and quit, giving them a vague story about a family emergency. I never went back. I abandoned everything I owned in that cottage. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear it. That soft, gentle whispering. And I wonder how many others heard that call and didn't have the strength to drive away. How many lost souls are standing in those woods right now, pale and gaunt, waiting to add another voice to the choir. The Headless Horseman is just a story, but the Pine children, they're real, and they're still waiting. There are places on this earth that are broken. I don't mean just neglected or abandoned. I mean fundamentally, irrevocably broken. Centralia, Pennsylvania, is one of those places. I've been an urban explorer for about 10 years, and my whole thing is documenting forgotten places. I've been to abandoned hospitals, derelict factories, entire ghost towns out west. But none of them felt like Centralia. For those who don't know, Centralia is the town with a fire burning beneath it. A coal mine fire, started back in 1962. It's been burning ever since, and it's expected to burn for another 250 years. The ground is hot, unstable, and vents poisonous gas. The government bought out most of the residents in the 80s and 90s. Today, the population is officially listed in the single digits, though most people say it's zero. It's a modern-day ghost town, a wound on the face of Pennsylvania. And for a guy like me, it was irresistible. I went in the late fall of 2015. I wanted to capture the town in that bleak, transitional light. I parked my car on the main highway and walked in. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. It's a mix of sulfur, damp earth, and something else. Something that smells like old secrets. The famous Graffiti Highway, a stretch of the old Route 61 that was abandoned and covered in decades of spray paint, was my first stop. It's strange. In this place of utter desolation, there was this explosion of crude, vibrant color. It was like a last, defiant scream against the silence. I spent hours walking the cracked pavement, taking photos. As the afternoon wore on, a thick fog began to roll in, mixing with the tendrils of steam that snaked up from fissures in the ground. The world shrank until it was just me and the road. That's when I first felt it. The feeling of being watched. Every urbexer knows this feeling. It's usually just your nerves, the silence playing tricks on you. You learn to ignore it. But this was different. It wasn't the vague paranoia of being in a creepy place. This was specific. It felt like dozens of eyes were on me, tracking my every move from the skeletal trees that lined the road and the gaping, black windows of the few remaining houses. I'd stop and scan the woods, but I never saw anything, just the trees and the fog. Still, the feeling was so intense it was like a physical pressure on my skin. I pushed on, deeper into the grid of what used to be the town. The streets are all overgrown now, nature slowly swallowing the pavement. I found the old municipal building, its brick facade stained black by time and smoke. The doors were gone, so I went inside. The air was thick and heavy. Every sound I made, the crunch of my boots on fallen plaster, my own breathing, echoed unnaturally in the dead quiet. I was in what used to be the main office, taking a picture of a rusted filing cabinet, when I heard a floorboard creak on the second floor. My blood ran cold. I froze, holding my breath, listening, silence. My logical brain kicked in. It's an old, decaying building, it's settling. Or it's an animal, a raccoon, a possum. But the sound, it was a slow, deliberate creak. The sound of a footstep. I quietly packed my camera into my bag, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak. "Is anyone up there?" The only answer was a profound, suffocating silence. The feeling of being watched intensified tenfold. It was in the room with me now. I could feel it radiating from the dark corners, from the doorway leading to the hall. I backed out of the building slowly, never taking my eyes off the shadowed interior. The moment my boots hit the soil outside, I turned and walked away, fast, not quite running. I decided to head for one of Centralia's most infamous landmarks, the abandoned Ukrainian Orthodox cemetery on the hill. It sits on one of the few plots of land that isn't directly on fire. It was a strange, lonely place. The fog was thicker up there, clinging to the headstones, some of which had started to tilt and sink into the unstable ground. I was trying to frame a shot of a particularly old, ornate cross when I saw them. At first, I thought they were statues. There were two of them, standing near the far edge of the cemetery, partially obscured by the fog and the drooping branches of a dead tree. They were tall and unnaturally thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothing that seemed to melt into the gloom. They were standing perfectly still, side by side, facing my direction. Not looking at me, exactly. More like observing my presence in their space. I lowered my camera, my mouth dry. These weren't kids. They weren't other explorers. There was something profoundly wrong about them. Their stillness was predatory. Their silence was a threat. I felt a primal fear, a deep-seated instinct telling me that I was prey and these were the hunters. I started backing away, slowly, carefully, over the uneven ground. I didn't want to make any sudden moves. Their heads didn't turn to follow me, but I knew their eyes were locked on me. As I reached the edge of the cemetery, I risked a final glance. A third figure had joined them. It was standing just behind the first two, slightly taller, its form even more indistinct in the thickening mist. That's when I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, stumbling down the hill, not caring about the noise. The feeling of being watched was no longer a pressure. It was a weight, pushing me down, trying to hold me there. I didn't look back again. I just ran, my lungs burning with the sulfurous air, until I reached the graffiti highway. As I scrambled back onto the pavement, the feeling lessened slightly. It was as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. I glanced back toward the hill, but I couldn't see the cemetery anymore. It was completely swallowed by the fog, but I felt like they were still there, at the edge of their territory, watching me go. The Watchers of Centralia. I got to my car, my clothes soaked with sweat and dew, my body trembling. As I drove away, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those tall, thin figures standing in the middle of the road. I developed my photos later that week. Most of them were fine, eerie, atmospheric shots of a ghost town. But the ones from the cemetery, they were strange. In every single photo I took on that hill, even the ones before I saw the figures, there are smudges in the background. Vague, human-shaped blurs at the edges of the frame, in the woods, behind the tombstones. Blurs that I swear weren't there when I was looking through the viewfinder. I've come to believe that the fire in Centralia didn't just drive people out. I think it burned a hole between worlds. Or maybe it just awakened something that was always there, sleeping under the coal seams. The people who refused to leave, who died in their homes, who clung to that broken land. Maybe some part of them never left. Maybe they became guardians of that desolation, silent, patient, and deeply resentful of outsiders. They don't want you to take pictures. They don't want you to explore. They just want to be left alone in their own private, smoking hell. And they will stand there, in the fog and the fumes, and watch you until you go. There's a saying among people who investigate the paranormal: some places are haunted by ghosts, but others are just sick. Dudleytown, Connecticut isn't haunted. It's sick. It's a patch of land that is fundamentally wrong, and it infects anyone who stays there too long. I know, because I was one of the skeptics who went there to prove it was all a hoax. I left a believer, and I think I took a piece of that sickness with me. My name is Mark, and back in 2011, I ran a small but popular blog dedicated to debunking paranormal claims. I was all about science, logic, and finding the rational explanation. So, when my readers kept requesting I investigate Dudleytown, the village of the damned, I jumped at the chance. The legends were almost comically over the top. A cursed family lineage, a spate of suicides and madness, mysterious beasts, and a place where no one could live for long. It sounded like a perfect storm of local folklore and confirmation bias. For those who don't know the history, Dudleytown was never really a town. It was a small, isolated settlement founded in the 1740s in the foggy hills of Cornwall. The land was terrible for farming, rocky, shadowed, and prone to odd weather. From the start, things went bad. People went insane. People took their own lives in gruesome ways. An epidemic swept through. By the early 1900s, it was completely abandoned, the forest already reclaiming the foundations of the homes. The legend claims the Dudley family brought a curse with them from England, a curse tied to their very blood. I got permission from the Dark Entry Forest Association, the group that now protects the land, under the guise of being a nature photographer. They strictly forbid paranormal investigations, and for good reason, as I would later learn. My plan was to spend a full day there from dawn till dusk, documenting everything with cameras, EMF meters, and audio recorders, and then write a scathing blog post about how I found nothing but birds and squirrels. My partner at the time, a fellow skeptic named Ben, came with me. We arrived on a crisp October morning. The woods were beautiful, all autumn colors and dappled sunlight. But the moment we crossed the old stone wall that marked the boundary of the settlement, The atmosphere changed. It wasn't a sudden drop in temperature like you read in books. It was a change in the quality of the air. It became heavy, still. The sounds of the forest, the birds, the insects, died away, leaving a silence that felt expectant. "You feel that?" Ben murmured, his usual bravado gone. "It's just the geography," I said, trying to sound confident. "We're in a hollow. It dampens the sound." But I knew that was a lie. This was different. We found the old cellar holes, stone-lined pits in the earth where the houses once stood. They looked like open graves. We set up our equipment around the most famous one, the cellar of the Horatio Carter home, a man who supposedly went mad and lost his entire family there. I started my routine, taking baseline EMF readings, setting up audio recorders, snapping photos. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The silence persisted, unnerving but uneventful. I was starting to feel vindicated. It was just a creepy, quiet forest. Then, around noon, our equipment started to act up. The brand new batteries in our EMF meters drained in a matter of seconds. The digital camera started showing corrupted files, images that were just gray static or bizarre, distorted colors. My audio recorder, which had been running continuously, suddenly had a 30-minute gap in the recording, an entire half hour of our time that was just gone. We hadn't noticed it passing. "That's weird," Ben said, looking at his watch. "I swear we just got here." He was right. It felt like we had only been there for an hour, but nearly 4 had passed. The sun was already starting to dip behind the tall trees that ringed the hollow, plunging us into a deep, premature twilight. The feeling of being watched, a common thread in these stories, I know, began to settle on us. It wasn't like Centralia, though. This didn't feel like eyes. This felt like a mind, a vast, non-human consciousness aware of us, pressing in on us. And it was deeply, deeply melancholic. I felt a profound wave of sadness wash over me, a hopeless, soul-crushing despair. I thought of every failure in my life, every regret, every loss. It was so overwhelming I had to lean against a tree to keep from falling to my knees. I looked at Ben, and I could see he was feeling it too. His face was pale, his eyes wet. "What is this?" he whispered. I just want to lie down. That's the sickness. That's the toll the land takes. It doesn't scare you out. It crushes you. It makes you want to give up, to lay down in one of those cellar holes and let the forest take you. We had to fight it, physically fight the urge to just surrender. We forced ourselves to keep moving, to pack up our malfunctioning gear. That's when we heard the sound. It wasn't a whisper or a scream. It was a child humming. A simple, tuneless little melody, coming from the direction of the Carter cellar hole. We froze. There was no one else there. We hadn't seen another soul all day. The humming continued, monotonous and sad. It was the sound of a child trying to comfort itself in the dark. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my backup camera, an old film SLR, and pointed it toward the cellar. I couldn't see anything, but I took a picture anyway. The flash was blinding in the gloom. The humming stopped. The silence that rushed back in was worse. It was a violated, angry silence. We grabbed our bags and started walking, almost jogging, back the way we came. We didn't talk. We just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, fighting that crushing wave of despair with every step. As we reached the stone wall that marked the edge of the property, I felt the pressure lift, as if a physical weight had been taken off my shoulders. The sounds of the forest returned. A bird chirped somewhere, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. We stumbled back to the car, got in, and just sat there for a minute, breathing heavily. "Never again," Ben said, and I agreed. The story should end there. It would have been a creepy day in the woods, nothing more. But the sickness of Dudleytown doesn't always let you go. I developed the roll of film from my SLR a few days later. Most of the pictures were just blurry shots of trees and rocks. But the last one, the one I took of the Carter cellar hole when I heard the humming, it made me drop the print on the floor. In the center of the frame, illuminated by the harsh flash, was the figure of a young boy. He was translucent, almost see-through, but he was undeniably there. He was sitting on the edge of the stone foundation, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was looking directly at the camera. But it wasn't his ghostly appearance that was the most terrifying part. It was his face. It was contorted in an expression of such absolute, Unending agony that it felt like looking into the face of hell itself. His eyes were wide, his mouth was open in a silent scream, and his translucent hands were clamped to the sides of his head, as if trying to block out a sound that had been tormenting him for centuries. I tore the picture up. I tried to forget it. I shut down my blog. I told Ben the picture didn't come out, but the damage was done. The despair I felt in those woods, it came home with me. It settled into my life like a fine dust. My relationship with Ben fell apart. I lost my job. I fell into a deep, listless depression that I couldn't seem to shake. It felt like the land had planted a seed of its own misery inside me, and it was slowly, patiently growing. I still have nightmares about that place, about the silence, the sadness, and the face of that boy. Dudleytown isn't about a curse or a ghost. It's a place where the veil between a human mind and pure, raw despair is terrifyingly thin. It's a cancer on the landscape, and if you get too close, it can metastasize. You don't have to die there to become one of its victims. Sometimes, you just have to visit, and you pay the toll for the rest of your life. My grandfather never spoke about Portlock. He was born there, in a small fishing village on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. His family, along with every other family, abandoned the place in 1949. They just left. They walked away from their homes, their boats, their livelihoods, and never went back. The official story is that the cannery moved, and the village became economically unviable. But if you asked anyone from the neighboring villages, anyone from Seldovia or Nanwalek, they'd tell you a different story. They'd tell you about the Nantinak. My grandfather passed away in 2018, and I inherited a box of his old things. Tucked away at the bottom, beneath fishing lures and faded photographs, was a worn leather journal. The entries were in his native Sugpiaq language, which I can only read haltingly. But the last few pages were in English. They were a raw, terrified account of his final weeks in Portlock. He wrote about a thing in the woods, a shadow that walked on two legs. He described finding large, human-like tracks in the mud near the salmon stream. He wrote about the logging crew that was working nearby, how they would hear screams from the forest at night, how their tools would go missing. Then, one of the loggers, a man named Andrew Kamluck, was found dead. His body had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. The official report said it was a bear mauling. My grandfather wrote, "Bears do not use a logging hook to kill a man. Bears do not leave a body looking like that." The final entry gave me chills that had nothing to do with the Boston winter outside my window. It is watching the village now. We see it at the tree line at dusk, tall and covered in dark hair. It is not an animal. It screams our names at night. My father says we must leave. We cannot fight it. We are not hunters, we are prey. We are leaving everything. Better to be poor and alive than rich in food for the Nantinak. Reading those words, I felt a deep, obsessive need to understand. I was a documentary filmmaker, always looking for a compelling story. This was more than a story, it was my history. I decided I was going to go to Portlock. I would retrace my grandfather's steps, film the ruins of the village, and try to separate the facts from the folklore. It was a profoundly stupid idea. I hired a bush pilot to fly me out the following summer. From the air, Portlock Bay is stunningly beautiful. A crescent of gray beach surrounded by emerald green forests and backed by snow-capped mountains. But as we descended, I could see the rot, the skeletal remains of the cannery, the collapsed roofs of the houses, all being slowly devoured by the relentless Alaskan wilderness. We landed on the beach during low tide. The pilot said he'd be back in 3 days. As his plane became a speck in the sky, I was struck by the most absolute silence and isolation I had ever experienced. I set up my camp on the beach, a safe distance from the tree line. The first day was spent exploring the ruins. It was eerie, walking through the collapsed homes, finding rusted pots and bits of old furniture. It really was like they had just dropped everything and fled. There was a palpable sense of fear that lingered in the air, a 70-year-old echo of panic. The first night was unsettling. As the sun set, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. Strange clicks, whistles, and a deep, guttural coughing sound that I couldn't identify. I told myself it was just the local fauna. I was in the wild after all. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Footsteps. Heavy bipedal footsteps, walking on the rocks just beyond the light of my campfire. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and a canister of bear spray, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I shone the light into the darkness, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like an hour, straining to hear anything over my own ragged breathing. Nothing. I eventually convinced myself it had been a bear walking on its hind legs for a moment, or just my imagination running wild in the oppressive darkness. The second day, I decided to follow the stream inland, the same stream my grandfather had mentioned. I was hoping to find the site of the old logging camp. The forest was dense, dark, and claustrophobic. The air was heavy with the smell of moss and decay. After about an hour of hiking, I found them. Tracks. They were huge, about 18 inches long and unmistakably humanoid. 5 toes, a distinct arch, a heavy heel print sunk deep into the mud. They were fresh. My blood went icy in my veins. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a man. I stood there, staring at the print, and I felt it again, that feeling of being watched. Not from one direction, but from all around me. The woods were suddenly silent. No birds, no squirrels. Just the sound of the water in the stream, and the feeling of countless eyes on me. A branch snapped behind me. Loud, close. I didn't think. I just ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't dare look back. I just ran toward the relative safety of the open beach. I burst out of the tree line and didn't stop until my feet were in the salt water of the bay. I turned back, panting, scanning the dark wall of trees. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was still there. It was as if something was standing just inside the shadows, its gaze boring into me. That night, I didn't bother with a campfire. I sat in my tent, in the dark with a hunting knife in one hand, and the bear spray in the other. The fear I felt was primal. It was the fear of a creature that has been hunted since the dawn of time. I understood now why they had all left. This wasn't just about a monster in the woods. This was about being in its territory. It wasn't hunting them for food. It was driving them out. Just after midnight, the screaming started. It came from deep in the woods, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that was somewhere between a woman's scream and the cry of a cougar. But it was laced with an articulate rage that was terrifyingly intelligent. The scream would sound, then silence. Then it would come from another direction, closer this time. It was circling my camp, toying with me. Then came the voice. My grandfather's journal had mentioned it, but I wasn't prepared for the reality. It was a low, guttural voice, and it was mimicking human speech, but imperfectly, like a parrot trying to form words. And it was saying my name, Mark, Mark. It sounded like it was coming from just outside my tent. I could hear it sniffing, a wet, heavy sound. I could hear its weight shifting on the sand. I was paralyzed by a terror so complete that I couldn't even breathe. I was going to die here, torn apart like that logger. My death just another mystery swallowed by the Alaskan wilderness. Suddenly, a rock the size of a fist hit the side of my tent with a loud thud, right next to my head. I yelped, a pathetic, strangled sound. The thing outside let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. Then, I heard it walk away, its heavy footfalls receding back toward the forest. I did not sleep. I sat there, shaking until the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. I packed my gear with frantic, clumsy hands. I didn't care about the documentary anymore. I just wanted to live. I stood on the beach for hours, staring out at the horizon, praying for the sound of an engine. When I finally saw the Bush pilot's plane, I broke down and cried with relief. As we took off, I looked down at the village of Portlock one last time, and I saw it, for just a second, standing at the edge of the trees, where the forest met the beach. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in dark, matted hair. Its arms were long, its build powerful. It stood there on 2 legs and watched the plane climb into the sky. It wasn't trying to hide. It was watching me leave. It was making sure I was gone. Some stories are true. Some legends are born from real events. The Nantinak, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, I don't know what it is. But I know it's real. And I know its home is in the silent, haunted woods of Portlock. My grandfather didn't flee because of a cannery. He fled because he knew that in that place, man is not at the top of the food chain. The deepest horrors are not always born in dark forests or abandoned towns. Sometimes they grow in the neat, quiet soil of small-town America, watered by secrets and resentment. I grew up in a town like that, just a few miles from Circleville, Ohio. I was a kid in the late 70s and early 80s when the letters started. And I can tell you, no ghost or monster is as terrifying as the monster you can't see. The one who knows your name, knows your secrets, and lives just down the street. The story of the Circleville Letter Writer is public record. But the records don't capture the feeling. They don't capture the paranoia that poisoned that town like a slow-acting chemical. It started in 1976. People all over Circleville began receiving anonymous, handwritten letters. They were crude, written in a distinctive blocky script, and they were filled with poison. The letters accused people of affairs, of corruption, of all manner of private sins. They were detailed, specific, and designed to cause the maximum amount of damage. They were sent to husbands and wives, to bosses and neighbors. They turned the town into a pressure cooker of suspicion. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Every friend could be an enemy. Every neighbor, a spy. My family wasn't targeted directly, at least not at first, but we felt the fallout. My dad was a teacher at the high school. He told us how the teacher's lounge, once a place of easy camaraderie, became silent and tense. People who had been friends for decades stopped speaking to each other, all because of a few lines of ugly handwriting on cheap paper. The most famous target, the one that escalated everything, was a school bus driver named Mary Gillespie. The letters she received accused her of having an affair with the superintendent of schools. The letters weren't just sent to her, they were sent to her husband Ron as well. They were relentless, filled with vulgar threats. One day, Ron Gillespie got a phone call. He left the house in a rage, telling his kids he was going to confront the person he believed was writing the letters. He was found dead a short time later. His car crashed into a tree. His gun, which had been fired once, was found next to him. The sheriff ruled it an accident, but everyone knew it wasn't. The letter writer had claimed their first victim. After that, the fear in town became a living thing. It was no longer just about gossip and ruined reputations. It was about life and death. The letters to Mary didn't stop. They became more vicious. "Gillespie, you have had 2 years of fun. Now you will pay," one of them said. Another threatened her children. I remember my mom telling me not to talk to strangers, but it wasn't about candy or getting into cars. It was a different fear. The monster wasn't an outsider, it was one of us. It was someone who went to the same grocery store, someone who sat in the pews at church, someone who watched the high school football games on Friday nights. And that was the most terrifying part. The evil was invisible. The police were stumped. The letters continued for years. Then, Mary Gillespie was driving her bus route one day and saw a sign posted on a fence. It was another vicious message, meant for her. When she went to tear it down, she discovered it was a booby trap. A gun, rigged to a string, set to fire when the sign was moved. It fired, but somehow it didn't hit her. This finally led to a suspect. The gun was traced back to a man named Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law. His ex-wife, Karen, was Ron Gillespie's sister. It was a messy, tangled family web. A handwriting expert said his script was a match to the letters. Paul Freshour was convicted of attempted murder and sent to prison, proclaiming his innocence all the way. Everyone in town breathed a sigh of relief. The monster was caught. The nightmare was over. Except it wasn't. Paul Freshour was in solitary confinement, and the letters kept coming. They had the same blocky handwriting, the same Circleville postmark. They were sent to more people, including the local newspaper and even to Freshour himself in prison. One letter read, "Now when are you going to believe you aren't going to get me?" This is the part of the story that still makes my blood run cold. The monster wasn't caught. Or, even worse, what if there was more than one? What if it was a group of people? What if it was an idea that had spread? A sickness that had infected the whole community? The letters prove that the person behind them could operate with impunity, even with a man in prison for their crimes. The system couldn't stop them. The police couldn't find them. They were a ghost haunting the mailboxes of the town. I was a teenager by then, and the story became our local legend. We'd drive past the spot where Ron Gillespie crashed his car. We'd whisper about who it could be: the quiet librarian, the friendly postman, the grumpy old man at the end of the block. Everyone was a suspect. The trust that holds a small community together was completely shattered. The letter writer hadn't just threatened people, they had harvested the town's soul. Paul Freshour served his time and was released in 1994. He died in 2012, still maintaining his innocence. The letters eventually stopped, fading away as mysteriously as they had begun. To this day, no one knows for sure who wrote them. The real letter writer was never caught. They could have died, they could have moved away, or they could still be there, living a quiet life, their secret locked away behind a pleasant smile. I moved away from Ohio years ago, but I still think about Circleville. I think about the terrifying power of a pen and a piece of paper. The horror of that story isn't supernatural. It's profoundly, terrifyingly human. It's about the darkness that can exist in the most ordinary of hearts. It's the chilling realization that you can live your whole life next to someone, share pleasantries over a garden fence, and never, ever know the secrets they keep. The greatest monsters don't have claws or fangs. They have neighbors, they have families, and sometimes they just have a pen, a stack of envelopes, and a list of all the things you thought no one else knew.